Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's educational webinar, Living the Grief of FTD, the Winding Path of Loss, Love, and Resilience. I'm Sharon Denny, AFTD Senior Director of Programs, and on behalf of everyone here, thank you for joining us today. A few housekeeping steps before we start. I'd like to remind you that our audience will be muted for the duration of the presentation. This helps to keep the background noise to a minimum so that everyone can hear our presenter clearly. If you have any technical issues, please write a message in the questions box and AFTD's Lauren Gauthier will try to address them with you. We'll have time for a Q&A midway through the presentation and again at the end. Please type your questions in this box as you think of them and we'll address as many as time permits. I'd also like to highlight a few resources that AFTD offers that can help you in your own FTD journey. Earlier this year, AFTD published Walking with Grief, a guide to understanding grief in FTD that features voices from our community. We hope this is a valuable companion to the information you're about to hear today. You can download the booklet by visiting tinyurl.com FTD Grief or by searching for it on the AFTD website. This webinar will be recorded and archived on our YouTube channel and webpage with all our prior educational webinars. Visit youtube.com/theaftd.org to find our website playlist. And finally, our helpline is the only such resource focused on FTD. It allows anyone to get in touch with master's level social workers on our staff who will answer any questions you may have about the diagnosis or living with this disease. At this point, I'd like to introduce our guest presenter. Mary O'Hara is a licensed clinical social worker with 15 years of experience working with families living with dementia. Her practice is focused on helping families understand, integrate, and cope with a dementia diagnosis at every stage of the illness. She assists in navigating the unique and challenging symptoms that an FTD diagnosis presents. She serves as an advocate to ensure access to the most appropriate support, resources, and care. Mary is dedicated to supporting families in their unique journey of living the best they can with dementia. She co-facilitates the FTD PPA Caregiver Support Group in Denver, Colorado, and is a member of AFTD's Partners in FTD Care Committee. Welcome, Mary. We're very glad you're here, and I'm happy to turn things over to you.
Thank you so much, Sharon. Is this screen share okay? Can you see my slides?
Looks great.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Sharon said I'm Mary O'Hara, and I'm a social worker in Colorado. My practice has focused on supporting people with neurological conditions and their families, and I've worked with the FTD and PPA community for many years. I first want to just acknowledge the AFTD for inviting me and thanking them for inviting me to talk about this really important subject. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge the families who shared their experience with me that I have woven through my presentation today. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge and honor those of you who have a diagnosis who are here today to be part of this really important conversation, and to the family members as well. So thank you all for being here. Today I'm going to be speaking about the experience of living with FTD and loss and grief. I'll be covering the way that grief presents itself and also how we can tend to ourselves in our grief and how we can support others in their grief. My hope is really that by understanding and naming some of your experiences, you can make space for what you need in this time, in your own unique grief, what you need to cope and to heal. We wish we could, but we cannot make this pain go away. But my hope, again, is with a greater understanding, you find what is going to be most helpful to you in this time. When I speak about grief today, I'm really speaking about the losses that begin even before the diagnosis, some of the early presenting symptoms, all the way through the progression of the disease at the end of life, and then even beyond. And I'm using I'm using FTD, but when I do that, I'm referring to FTD and PPA and CBD, all of the conditions that fall under FTD. Ooh. I'm unable to get to my next slide. Let's see. Okay, there we go. So I want to begin with really a shared definition of what grief is. Grief comes from the Latin word gravare, which means heavy, and I'm sure that feeling resonates with many of you. It's important to know that grief is a very natural, emotional and physical and spiritual response resulting from a significant loss. And it's thought to be really a reflection of love for someone who we lose, or something that we lose, or even losing a part of ourselves. It is, though painful, it's actually the body and the brain and the soul's healthy response to loss. And in that sense, it's not a problem to solve. It's not something to get over. There's nothing wrong with how you feel. While it's really normal to want to avoid the pain of grief, really the only way to cope with our grief is to live through it. It is thought to be something that we tend to and that we live through. Many grief experts use the metaphor of a river in grief, and that when we lose someone or something important to us, we step into this river, and the river doesn't end. It just changes with time. So at certain points there may be rocks and debris and rough waters. There are also moments where the river holds us. And so it goes on, and our grief doesn't end, that it just changes with time. I think it's also really important to acknowledge that former losses might condition current losses or future losses. So grief you've experienced in the past might return when new grief presents itself. I mentioned that I invited some family members to share their experience of grief. And it's hard for me to see the quote, but I'll let you take a moment to read it while I get another copy to read. Okay, I can read the second quote now. My experience with grief has been like a never-ending roller coaster. At first, I was actually relieved to hear the diagnosis. All of my frustrations, anger, and self-doubt were affirmed by knowing that there was something real happening with Mike. I remember thinking, at least I didn't break him. A disease has caused my husband's behavior to change. There is a saying in grief work that the loss shapes the grief. That and this is true throughout the course of the disease, but also at the end of life, the way that a person dies also shapes the grief that we experience. And we know this is so true with FTD and so unique about FTD, that there's 1,000 losses along the way, thousands of losses, so many goodbyes that family members are making, but also if a person has insight into their experience that they are experiencing. And some of those losses are evident to the person themselves and to their family members. But then there are also these secondary losses that take place underfoot. And maybe for the person that is, the loss of their job, the loss of social connections, the loss of things that they used to enjoy doing, a loss of sense of self, maybe their spirituality has changed. And then for the and also things like finances. And then also for the family members, there are secondary losses. They're losing their partner or their parent. Again, financial losses, social losses, For both the person and the partner, there could be losses of intimacy, an overall loss of a shared experience, a loss of a certainty that they felt. And for families with young children at home, witnessing the loss of that innocence of the child not having the parent there in the same way is another loss. And it can feel like everything you knew and trusted and believed and hoped for changes. So in addition to those losses, there are these very unique experiences of ambiguous loss and anticipatory grief. And I'm going to go into more detail later on about these. But really this idea of ambiguous loss is that a great deal of confusion around the loss because there is not closure. There has not been a death. The person is here, but they're not here in the same way. And then anticipatory grief, this experience of grieving someone who's not yet gone, that are both very unique to the experience of FTD. And I think also acknowledging that sometimes with this disease, the grief and the grief process can be overshadowed by how you are having to adapt and intervene to some of the changes. So maybe a loss occurs, maybe there's some shock with how did this happen? I wasn't expecting this, or just some shock to what has changed, whether it's change in language or a new behavior. Intervening, maybe making changes or getting different therapies involved or different supports involved, adapting to all of that change. And then that repeats itself again, these compounding losses that repeat themselves without the chance to process and without the chance to grieve. And just that cycle of compounding losses can be really exhausting. I hear so often families, well-meaning family and friends, will ask someone with a disease or their partner, so how are you doing? And it can feel so hard to answer that question because look at this slide. These are very complicated ways that this disease is impacting your life. And so to elaborate a little bit more about why the loss with FTD is especially complicated, each loss for family members that you grieve means that more care is needed, means that more support is needed. And for the person, each loss, means more care is required by the person who supports you. The changes, especially in behavioral variant FTD, the changes in behavior and personality can impact how you feel. If the person with a diagnosis is treating you differently, that's going to impact how you feel in your grief. If you feel like what you're doing is not appreciated or not seen, that can have an impact on your experience. So often families are forced to make these changes, these unimaginable changes, to help the person stay safe or to help maintain their dignity. But their efforts might be understood if the person lacks insight into why these changes need to happen. And I hear families describe sometimes a relief a relief after some of the changes that they made, even as hard as they were, and they didn't want to make these changes, but there's some relief in maybe taking over the business or transitioning someone away from driving. It can be hard for other people to understand this disease, much less your very unique experience with all these complicating factors. And I think also for everyone, sometimes it's hard for us to get our heads around how a person can do certain things, but maybe they're no longer able to do other things. So maybe how can he do a 1,000-piece puzzle but has lost all of his language? It's really hard for us to get our minds around. For those people who experienced a conflict in the relationship with the person, their grief might be different. They may wrestle with not being able to resolve that relationship or feeling differently about the person because of the language loss or because of the changes in behavior. I think also what is unique with this disease is this uncertainty of not knowing how it will progress. In support groups, you might hear stories of other people's experience, but you don't know how that will take shape for you. And I know many parents or adult children have a worry about their own risk of this disease. And so I think there's just this enormous paradox that in the midst of your grief, you're faced with experiencing all of these other really challenging parts of this experience. Family members described is it starts with feeling sad and questioning why, and the unfairness of, and then the unfairness emotions, because I have to solve how to move forward with new changes without his input. It's always there, pushed to the back of my mind forever. I'm sorry, there's something blocking my ability to read the slide. Let's see. There we go. Forever gnawing, not always conscious, but easily recalled and either acknowledged or shelved, depending on how certain I feel that I'm doing the best I can. I vacillate between being on his side and feeling sadness at the lost, and being on the other side, one of an outsider, having to do things that I'm mad about and not sure that I'm doing them. This questioning ourselves. Oh my goodness. Okay. For the first year after the diagnosis, I felt overwhelming sadness and anger most of the time. Sad that our lives, our dreams for the future would be cut short. Angry that Mike did not understand his own disease. He has anosognosia, an inability to understand his own condition, and that he couldn't express normal emotions like empathy, affection, or humor. I was frantic with worry and grief. I wanted to mention just a few types of grief. I don't want to get too caught up in these definitions, but I did want to share these so that you have an understanding and you can go read a little bit more. So there is a term, there's a type of grief called dementia grief, and it really describes this experience of moving through these repetitive patterns of loss. And it shares these certain characteristics that I've described earlier. So the compounded loss, the anticipatory grief, disenfranchised grief, which is grief that goes unrecognized by others, and then the ambiguous loss. I also want to just define complicated grief. This is a clinical term. For some people, feelings of loss are so debilitating and they don't change over time. And it feels as though grief has almost become the person's identity. And this is known as complicated grief, sometimes also called persistent complex bereavement disorder. And in complicated grief, the emotions are so long lasting and severe that a person has trouble recovering and resuming their own life. There is, with complicated grief, a person does need professional help. There's an incredible center out of Colombia called the Center for Complicated Grief. If you wanted to go learn more about this type of grief, if you were concerned about yourself or someone else, and on that website at the Center for Complicated Grief, there is also a tool to search for grief therapists in your area who have a specialty in this type of grief treatment. And then another type of grief I wanted to define was this idea of integrated grief, that after experiencing some of the most intense symptoms of grief, those are very acute symptoms of grief, integrated grief is this transition into a more lifelong stage of grief. It doesn't mean that there aren't moments of more acute grief that come up, maybe especially around holidays or anniversaries, but so those do exist, but it really describes a new place that a person has arrived to with their grief, where it is more folded into daily life. Since that awful first year, I've tried to stay busy and productive, pushing grief down until it pops up like a beach ball held under the water. When grief pops up, I cry, I scream, I rage for an hour or so. I remember crying as I noticed that he was no longer able to do his weekly Bible study or when he lost his job. Each one of those milestones hit me like a ton of bricks as I tried to process the profound loss. Watching my best friend and partner in life forget words, resist, regress, these things bring me unspeakable sadness. I really want to take a moment to normalize some of the experiences, the very spiritual and physical and emotional experiences of loss. These experiences and these symptoms are not only appropriate, but in some situations they are protective. And even though these are uncomfortable and can feel so messy, it also suggests that this is the process of grief. And I think it speaks to the support we need because these experiences can be so intense. You've probably heard of the different stages of grief designed by Kubler-Ross, which are anger, bargaining, denial, depression, and acceptance. And those may exist for some of you. Those were really designed for the person, or those were about a person who is dying. That was where the framework came from. That was the experience of the person who's dying. But I wanted to highlight a few other experiences that I hear quite a bit in my work with families and in our group. So this concept of denial, I hear a lot about, whether it's in terms of he's in denial that this is happening or his sister is in denial that this is happening. I want to emphasize that denial is a really important coping skill. It can help us dose our pain. It can help us pace our feelings so they don't hit us all at once. And I want to differentiate that between a person's lack of insight, their lack of awareness into what's happening to them, which we know with FTD, someone with a diagnosis may lack that insight. So it's not that they're in denial or they're coping by not acknowledging what's happening. It's truly that their brain, that the disease has affected their brain's ability to understand what's happening to them. Anger is another emotion that I hear quite a bit about. I show you this image to make the point that anger is really the tip of the iceberg, but underneath are all these other, at the root are all these other really powerful emotions that are usually what's causing our anger. So we can project anger because we are afraid, because we are because we feel disrespected, because we feel hurt, because we feel grief, or we feel embarrassed. So it's so normal to feel anger, but it's so important to ask yourself, what is at the root of this anger that I need to tend to right now? Guilt and FTD have a really funny way of making us, or grief has a funny way of making us feel guilty. FTD has a way of making us feel guilty about a lot of things. Guilt can convince us of some badness within us, that we did something wrong, that we feel like we have to compensate for something. It makes us believe that we fall short in some way. And there's so many experiences with this disease where we feel that family members feel that they fall short in supporting someone. But really, unless it's based in some kind of remorse for doing something or hurting someone, your grief is likely not realistic. It's a distortion of your thoughts. And we can reduce guilt by really challenging that irrationality of it. Did I do something wrong? I didn't do anything wrong. Also, letting go of perfectionism can help us reduce our guilt, decreasing our own self-criticism, and just being aware of our expectations of ourselves. I think this is an example of our thoughts causing additional suffering in this time that's already difficult enough. Avoidance is something else I wanted to shine a light on. This is this attempt to block out or reduce unpleasant feelings. And some avoidance during grief is very normal, but it's not healthy when it becomes your go-to coping skill or someone's go-to coping skill. So this would present if a person was not talking about what they were feeling, not talking about the experience, focusing all their energy on other people and not tending to their own needs, or using substance to numb themselves. And then I wanted to mention a little bit about depression and anxiety within grief. You know, grief and depression have a lot in common, and high stress and grief can trigger symptoms of depression and even anxiety. And one big difference is that grief tends to come in waves, that you can grieve and then you can also still find pleasure and joy. But depression is very persistent and pervasive. It doesn't have any of those fluctuations. But the good news for both depression and anxiety are that there are many treatments, and there is a way to manage those moods. Someone shared their experience of avoidance and grief. I've been avoiding things lately. I feel like I've been grieving for years, so it can be hard to keep dwelling on it. I seem to get stuck and can't do the things I need to do. Unfortunately, if I think about the last several years, I get very upset again. Watching Dave's decline and seeing him lose relationships with families, especially the grandkids, was extremely depressing and frustrating, and I feel like I wasn't doing enough to help him. I hope I can find a way to deal with the grief and the guilt. I mentioned the concept earlier of ambiguous loss. This was described by Dr. Pauline Boss to articulate the experience of someone who is physically present but mentally or emotionally or cognitively absent. This grief, she describes as this loss is the most stressful loss because there is no closure. Because there's been no death, there's no recognition, there's no rituals around the loss. And in fact, you might hear other people in your life say things like, "Oh, you look the same," or "You should be thankful that she's here, that you still have this time." And that can be really painful to hear in this ambiguity, because we don't know. The ambiguity prevents us from knowing how to feel, how to cope, how to move forward. And Dr. Boss's theory is that this freezes the grief process. And I think in FTD, the ambiguity is intensified by confusion about abilities. How can he do these things but then struggle in these areas? Or how is he capable of this but not that? And then also in the presentation where a person lacks empathy or has apathy, there's that loss of emotion that can make this ambiguous loss more painful. And so as a result of ambiguous loss, people can feel very isolated. There can be this confusion of identity even for the person experiencing their own ambiguous loss. I'm here, but I'm not the same person I was. Who am I now? For spouses, I'm married, but I feel like a widow. So that struggling with who are we, defining us. There can be very intense feelings of anger and guilt, even powerlessness. And some people cope by creating this emotional distance to avoid the pain, maybe stuffing feelings or numbing themselves. And additionally, as a result of this, family members may disagree about if a person is here or not here, if they, how they define the presence or absence. Is he himself or is he someone else? And we have ways of responding to ambiguous loss that we know can help cope with this ambiguity. One of them is to acknowledge the loss, normalize it, talk about it, share this experience of this very ambiguous loss and unclear loss. And in that, we are also needing to increase our tolerance for the ambiguity, our acceptance of the ambiguity, that he can be here and not here. This both and thinking, holding two conflicting ideas at the same time. So I can be heartbroken and grateful. I can be angry and also have compassion. Another recommendation that Dr. Boss describes is redefining certain relationships. whether that's your relationship with the person or your relationships with people who understand, or and making sure that you have that community who does understand. Family meetings to talk about if everyone is on the same page, or hear everyone's opinions or experiences with this ambiguous loss, and even sharing communications with family who don't live nearby, that this is what's happening, so you're also bringing them up to date about the losses. Because the ambiguity interferes so much with our relationships, we must build new traditions around holidays or around certain important family events. We must adapt them to this time, because we may not be able to fit the old way that we used to do things into this new time. And then finally, tempering our own need for control, accepting what we cannot change and focusing on what we can change is another way of dealing with this ambiguity. And that seeing anxiety from the ambiguity is very normal and also manageable. And I'm going to talk about some ways to manage that later on. The ambiguous loss of seeing the man I've known for 30 years disappear into the abyss of FTD while still looking the same has made it difficult for me to accept the full loss of this disease. How could this be fair? Why did it happen to Jeff and consequently to me? And now I have to take care of him and his needs without an ounce of appreciation, let alone recognition for what it takes to do this. It was really difficult sharing Jeff's behaviors and the impact they had on me and family, with my family and Jeff's. My support system is in California, so they could not see the changes that I was explaining. What makes this ambiguous loss different is the emotional disconnection from my father due to his apathy. The being that is left in my father isn't my father. He looks like a skinnier, frailer version of my father, but he is some other being I'm not familiar with. He has what feels like an impenetrable wall around his heart. He's distant and lacks the ability to connect on a human level. That's perhaps the most difficult part. It's sometimes maddening. Another concept I mentioned earlier is this idea of anticipatory grief, which really describes grieving the loss of a person before they die, grieving the loss of a future together, the dreams, the hopes you had that will not be. And FTD, as the disease progresses, limits the person's ability to share in that grief, to share in that experience with family. Another part of this is not knowing how long the disease will go on for, how much time is left. There's so much uncertainty around that. Imagining what life would be like after FTD. And some people experience this guilt or the shame for wishing that it were over. They're just wishing that the pain would end, that the suffering would end. It's such a normal experience. Anticipatory grief is there to help us prepare emotionally for the future, for the loss in the future. And it doesn't mean that we grieve less later on. It just means that we're processing some of that grief while the person is with us. On one hand, I'm prepared for Mike to die. I've bought a double site for our ashes to be buried in a beautiful memorial garden. I filled out paperwork for brain donation to UCSF, and I found songs I want to play at his funeral. I know that Mike has a deep faith and is not afraid to die, and that we will be together again in heaven when we will both be whole again. But on the other hand, I know I'll miss him terribly when that time comes. Even the way he is now, unable to speak, helpless, shuffling, a 6'4" giant who loves root beer and his big stuffed animal, German Shepherd. I'm afraid to dive deeper into my heart to see how it would feel when my husband is gone and is no longer with me every day. I fear I'm forgetting what my husband was like because I'm getting more used to what he is now. I'm learning. I needed to acknowledge the experience of children and grief in FTD. I'll just say a few points and then refer you to another center that has a lot more resources. It's so normal for children to experience such a range of both physical and emotional symptoms with grief. They too experience ambiguous loss and anticipatory grief, but often lack the the context and the understanding of what that is, so that can leave them feeling very isolated. Children have this amazing ability to integrate their loss into play and into school and into other extracurricular activities. So while they might not, it's okay that they're not grieving all of the time. They may repeatedly ask for clarity, for understanding, just to make sure they know the story. Children can develop this type of magical thinking where they believe that they are responsible for an illness. And so continuing to talk about it is a way to clarify that understanding for them, that this is not their fault. It's so important for you to be open about your grief experience, to model your grief for them so they know it's okay, and continuously assure them that their grief matters, their loss matters, that they're safe, that their family is safe. It can also be helpful to help them think of what they can say to other people who ask about their parent, and also who else they can be talking to about this. There are experts who you can talk to find help in navigating this. The Center for Complicated Grief that I mentioned has an app for parents that you can download so that you have access to professionals to ask certain questions about your child in grief. And also, again, a list of grief counselors who you can find. Okay, I think we'll pause there for a moment.
Mary, thank you so much. It's really, you've covered so much information and so much of the varied experiences families face with this disease. You know, I love the way that you described right up front, really, that the loss shapes the grief. And I think everybody listening and folks who've worked in FTD know the extent of the losses and how varied they are, how continual they are, and how profound they are throughout the whole journey. And I think you've just done a wonderful job describing the range of emotions and the need to be really gentle with all of those emotions that people may experience related to this. There's no playbook that comes with the disease. There's certainly no playbook that comes with the grief that's associated with it. And so I really appreciate your presentation thus far. There's a couple questions, and I know that we're going to move on to the rest of your presentation, but I did want to ask, you've mentioned complicated grief a couple times. Could you just say, how would somebody know if they were experiencing complicated grief?
So I think I mentioned earlier that it is a grief experience that doesn't have any relief, that it almost feels like it's consumed your identity. It is, again, a clinical grief. And so if someone is concerned about their own grief experience, I would encourage them to talk to their either their provider about getting a referral for grief counseling. And then perhaps that person can help them explore if their grief is complicated. So that is I know that doesn't give a number of details about it, but because complicated grief can be experienced while a person is caring for someone, like within FTD, and also upon death, I just want to leave it more general that if you are concerned about your own grief, that you don't feel that you have moments of relief from this pain, that I would encourage you to seek help.
So it's not associated with the stage of the disease, whether the person's still living or passed away. It's the
can come at any of those different times. Yeah.
Yeah. Another question. You know, the question is, I'm just going to read it. It's, I went on a 12-year journey with my wife, and when her death came, I felt I'd already done the grieving necessary and moved on. My family and children in particular had a difficult time with me being so ready to move on. Do you have advice for what to say to them?
Wow, I think that's such a common experience. I hear that so often. Advice on what to say. I wonder if just sharing your experience of you've dealt with this anticipation of the loss for 12 years, maybe more, and that has you have done so much of your grieving in that time, and that you continue to grieve, but it just looks different than their grief right now. That the grief never ends. It's changed shape, and for you, it's changed shape at that time upon her death.
Thank you. And you mentioned also earlier some of the common symptoms in FTD with that lack of awareness or anosognosia, and also apathy that individuals diagnosed, especially with behavioral FTD, can often experience. Someone's wondering what the impact of those symptoms on the grief of the person with FTD is. And is it possible, is it fair even for a care partner to think that the individual diagnosed may have a bit of a blunted experience of grief, and that, and I think sometimes that belief or that hope is also something that brings comfort for the care partner. Is that something that you've heard in the group or that you can speak to a little bit?
Say that last part again, that the
So I think that there's a hope sometimes on the part of care partners that if the disease is in fact blunting the response of the individual or their awareness of what they're experiencing, is their grief less as a result of that?
The grief of the caregiver or of the person?
The person with the disease. Is their experience of grief?
You know, this is just in my own personal experience working with people with a diagnosis. They may have insight into certain parts of their loss, but not into others. And so I don't want that to disqualify that they're grieving. It may take different questions or different prompts to help them explore it. It may take art instead of words to help them express their fear and their loss. But I have had experiences where the family has kind of dismissed the person's ability to recognize what's happening to them. But then talking to the person, they are able to share more about what the loss is like for them. And maybe they can't share it in the way that they could before the onset of the illness, but there is some recognition there. And again, that's going to be different with every person. But I have seen that experience where a person is unaware of certain parts of the disease, but aware that a lot is changing and that there is loss.
So there's an emotional aspect that we retain at some level, which is what I hear you saying, and not discount the existence of that. Mm-hmm. So thank you for that. We do have other questions. I'm sure we'll have more. I want to ask you at this point to go ahead with the rest of the presentation, and we'll come back for questions at the end. So thanks.
Okay. Am I back on, or do I have to do anything? Okay, there we go.
You're good to go. Yep.
Okay. For the second part of our talk today, I wanted to talk more about living alongside loss and grief in FTD. In addition to all the things that people tell you, getting good rest and staying hydrated, there's a few things that I want to introduce to you that maybe you haven't thought of or haven't done. I don't want this to add to the list of things that you feel you are already doing, but I want these to feel more bite-sized, more just small and accessible to you. And maybe you try different things and see what works best for you. So we know that movement is so important in grief. It allows us to move these feelings through us. And obviously walking is a great way to do that. But I wanted to introduce this practice of grief yoga. So this is using movement and vibration and sound to allow that same process to happen without words. So if you Google grief yoga, you can find some different classes that have different exercises that do help again, help us move some of these very powerful feelings through us. Writing can be really incredible. It can help you gain control of your own story. Some people really find it helpful to journal. I encourage people to often write letters. Maybe write a letter to FTD, or maybe write a letter to the person who's diagnosed, and if you're caring for someone, and then not intending to show them that letter, but then write a letter in response to that letter, just for yourself. If you have a diagnosis, again, writing a letter to this illness, or even to your partner who's supporting you in this time. If journaling and letters aren't for you, making lists of what is most sad for you, and then a second column of what you're grateful for. Making a list of what's gone and what's changed, and also a list of what remains, can be really therapeutic. It's so important for you to have different places to connect. You need a community that's going to go deep with you, that understands this. And you also need people who are going to distract you, who are going to laugh with you. So you need a place to process it, and you need an escape from it too. You need a place where you don't think about it. Being as kind to yourself as you would be to a friend. This is a really hard thing to do. I'm going to take you through an exercise of self-compassion in a moment. But breath work is another way of doing this, of just grounding ourselves in the moment, taking care of ourselves through relaxation. And I think also taking pride in the love that you give every day, despite the response that you sometimes feel. But you are really doing an incredible job giving this love every day. And for someone who is diagnosed, taking pride in doing everything that you can to live your best with this illness and take care of yourself in this time. We have research that shows that creating routines and creating rituals in grief can offer a sense of control. So this is also something that you might start to integrate as a new routine or a new ritual. You probably think about FTD so much, but it's more rare that you allow yourself to give grief its moment, to dedicate or carve out a little bit of time to honor yourself, to honor the person, to honor the relationship, to honor your spirituality around it. So carving out a little bit of time, and maybe that means just looking up at the stars or lighting a candle, but honoring it in some way. I want you to be aware that when we are struggling, it's really easy for our negative thoughts to take over and kind of color what's happening to us. So we tend to add meaning to things that don't have that meaning, or we add a story onto, why someone didn't call us back, that she can't handle this. No, maybe something else was going on. So be aware that you might be adding on meaning to what's happening. And also being aware of your of wanting to numb the pain at all. When people ask you how you're doing, I know that it can be a hard question to answer, or they ask how the person's doing. Answer in the moment. Answer in the today, or even in the afternoon. This morning was really hard, but today I'm feeling a little bit lighter. Or this morning I was really feeling okay, and now I feel that heaviness again. So just answer in the moment right now. Reminders can be really helpful, and maybe you can fill in the blank with these and then continue to take these with you. But the reminders that life will never be the same, but you fill in the blank is still possible. Or just because I feel heartbroken doesn't mean, or just because this happened doesn't mean. Those can also be very helpful and healing. I wanted to take you through this self-compassion exercise. It can be something you do for yourself throughout the day or in difficult moments. It is important to practice it in neutral moments so that you become familiar with it. So we'll do that now. So you put your hand on your heart and you acknowledge the pain, that this hurts, this is so hard, this sucks. The second part is that you acknowledge that you're not alone in this feeling. other people understand. And then the third part is asking that you be kind to yourself. Can I give myself the love and compassion that I need right now? Can I be patient? Can I forgive myself? So this very short sequence, but it's a chance for you to support yourself in a way that you'd support a friend in this really difficult time. Because anxiety and worry can be such a big part of our grief experience, I wanted to just give you a few tools to ground ourselves. Grounding ourselves is really the antithesis of anxiety, coming back to the present moment. And so here's some tools to do that. Box breath is a really simple breathing exercise where you inhale for a count of 3, you hold, and then you exhale for 4, and then you hold again for 3. And you can increase the time that you inhale and hold. The key is that you just exhale for 1 breath longer. And this activates the relaxation response. This activates our parasympathetic nervous system, which is in contrast to our fight or flight, to that stress response. So this will calm you down doing a few rounds of that. Another tool for staying in the moment is just naming 5 things that you see, or using your 5 senses to name what you're feeling, again, just to ground yourself. So using your 5 senses, I taste coffee in my mouth, I feel my clothes resting on my body, I hear a bird outside, I smell burnt toast, whatever it may be, but just going through a few cycles of naming your senses can again ground you. 10, it's very simple, but 10 just deep breaths to give your mind a chance to rest. And then if the mind is so worried about what it cannot control, and you're worried about something that you can't plan for, that you can't address by doing something, asking yourself, what can I control right now? I can take a shower, I can go get a glass of water, I can call a friend. There are many things that you can control in those moments. Another thing that you might do when you feel very out of control is just thinking about what's going okay, thinking about what went well that day, no matter how small. Wrestling with this ongoing acceptance that we have to continue to do in FTD. Just as we accept and adapt to a loss and maybe even grieve some of that loss, a new loss emerges that we have to accept all over again. So this is this ongoing process of acceptance. And I just want to redefine acceptance for us, that it really is the willingness to see and experience things as they are, and not what we wish was different. It's not a process of the mind, it's a bodily process that you are forced into doing because of this very painful experience. But when we practice acceptance, we start to struggle less with certain emotions, maybe guilt or maybe anger, and then we stop letting them define us too. And we can sometimes find freedom when we're no longer fighting a certain feeling. If you always feel guilty or you always feel anger, accepting certain parts of the illness might allow you a freedom from those feelings. Acceptance is not being okay with what's going on. It's not giving up. It's not resignation. It's recognizing that you can hold on and let go at the same time. It's also, it allows us to, when we resist accepting things that are happening, that just can add a layer of suffering to this really difficult time. After time, I think that I've become numb to his losses and learned to accept the level at which he can perform. This is when my grief subsides and I don't feel so overwhelmed with meeting every expectation I might have had in the past. It might sound strange to someone who hasn't been through it, but I instantly, upon diagnosis, I found acceptance, peace, and relief. I'm a doer and a fixer in stressful situations, so I immediately went into fixer mode upon diagnosis. Okay, we can't do anything about fixing FTD. What can we do to make sure he's not in a situation where he can hurt himself or others? Within 45 days of his diagnosis, we moved my dad out of his house into assisted living, sold his house and car, and restructured his life to ensure his safety. Those days were hard, both physically and emotionally. I think I cried every single one of those days, but it's what needed to be done. With every box being packed up and decision being made, I processed what was going on. Sometimes we have to work through things while doing things. So sometimes we, as we are grieving, we are processing and accepting all at the same time, because certain things have to happen in the interest of someone's safety or well-being. David Kessler is one of the leading experts on grief, and he worked very closely with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and he has described this 6th stage of grief, which is finding meaning. He believes, and he's very thoughtful and careful to say that there is no meaning in this loss. There's no meaning in this disease or in death. Your loss is not a lesson. It is not a test. It is not something to handle. It is something heartbreaking that has happened. And meaning is what comes after we recognize that. He believes that finding meaning can transform grief into a more hopeful experience. Finding meaning is deeply personal, and it takes many different forms. For some people, maybe it's getting involved in research. For some people, it means maybe planting a garden. For others, it means running a race or going to a certain place to honor yourself or the person or the relationship. But I think that is really the question at the heart of meaning, is how do we honor the person? How do we honor our relationship? So I wanted to just talk about some of the seeds that I hope can be planted after our conversation today. I want to reemphasize that grief really is a healing response. And I want you to see that there is strength in how, because of grief, we fall apart and we rebuild and we go on, even despite not wanting to in some cases. By recognizing and honoring your fortitude and your resilience and your courage and the adaptations that you've made every day, that is a way of honoring yourself and the person. Note that just even hanging on every day takes so much courage and strength, and take pride in the care that you offer and in the support that you give. And remind yourself of the person is so grateful for your advocacy, for keeping them safe, for the connections that you continue to provide for them, and for the quality of life that you give them despite this disease. And we can find balance in this time with still maintaining the positive memories and hanging on to those, and also seeing what remains. I think there's so much focus on what's lost, but focusing also on what remains is an important part of our coping. Some families reflected on this. I asked him to tell jokes, something he's always loved and still mostly able to do, even though I've heard them 1,000 times and could repeat them. My father was and still is an incredibly kind and empathic man. I hope his kindness and empathy lives on in me. The love connection we have will always be with me, but I know I'll miss his physical presence deeply. I'd rather have what he is now than not at all. I'm very grateful to be a part of his life during this journey. Seeing him every day allows me to be more compassionate and nurturing mode regularly. I appreciate having what's left of him. And finally, one of my biggest challenges is learning to expect less and less from Jeff. It's a paradigm shift from looking at Jeff and seeing what he's lost, what he used to know and be able to do, to now seeing and appreciating what he still can do and what he still knows. If you are joining us today and you are supporting someone who is living with this type of grief, I just wanted to say thank you for that, and share a few ideas of how you might offer your support. Just this really simple sequence, because there are often no words, but to recognize and see them by saying, this is so hard. I hear your pain. I see your pain, and you are not alone. Just that really simple sequence of those thoughts can be really supportive of what a person needs to hear. You can be someone who offers balance to a grief movement. You can offer them laughter, offer them permission to feel everything that they're feeling. Help them adapt holidays and traditions around the illness or around their grief. This is something that so many families with FTD are forced to do, and so having your support is so important in those adaptations. Help them find ways of honoring the person. Ask them more stories. Tell me another story about that, or tell me another wonderful memory. Ask them how they are today. Focus it on just in this moment, how they're doing. Sometimes because they cannot see their strengths anymore or feel hope, see their strengths for them and offer to hold their hope until they can find it again. And help them practice accepting help. Don't ask them what they need. Just show up with what might be useful and helpful to them. It'll be good for them to practice. So in conclusion for today, a number of families shared what they would want other people to know. This is what they said. I imagine I'll never stop grieving the life that FTD stole from us, but as I try to balance that grief with gratitude for the years we've had together, I count my blessings every day, and that helps me with the grief more than anything else. What's helped me most? Acceptance that I can't change things. I can only make the best of them. Focus on what you can do to improve your loved one's life as well as your own, rather than what you cannot do. I appreciate what we had and miss it all the time, but more importantly than those moments, I try to remember the feelings associated with them, to remember the joy and the pleasure and the happiness associated with them. And then finally, there's a beautiful quote by Margaret Rousseau that I wanted to share about the path to deeper acceptance, patience, and love. The steady decline cannot be stopped, but the poignant moments can be savored and the impossible moments gotten through. Living in the moment, people with dementia can teach us to do the same. They can show us the route to deeper acceptance, patience, and love. So a special thank you to all of the families who contributed their thoughts that I included in our presentation today. And then just some resources that I wanted to share with you. If you are interested in reading any books about grief and dementia grief, or in finding meaning in grief, I've included Pauline Boss's Loving Someone Who Has Dementia is a book I'd recommend. Also, Finding Meaning, The Sixth Stage of Grief is another book I wanted to share. The Center for Complicated Grief at Columbia is included at the bottom of the website. Also, grief.com includes a grief counselor directory. So I think if you are concerned about yourself, whether it's your grief experience or anxiety or depression that you're experiencing because of what's changed, I really encourage you to reach out for support. So Sharon, I think we can return to some questions.
Great. Mary, thank you again. It's such a lovely presentation, and I think you've presented this really challenging information in such a supportive way. I can't thank you enough. And it is such a difficult experience, such a difficult concept really to integrate into the living with this disease. And we have some really good questions. So I'll start with a very specific one you had mentioned when you were speaking about resources for grief and children. You had mentioned a specific grief app. Can you just, I can speak to that again so where people can find that?
Yeah, if you go to Complicated Grief columbia.edu, or if you Google the Center for Complicated Grief, it will take you to Columbia's website, and you can search for an app on that website. I forget what the app is specifically called, but you can find it on that website, and it is because parents all over the country are dealing with complicated grief and supporting their children in grief. They've developed this app where you can contact a professional to answer questions for you or help you navigate supporting your child in grief.
Great, thank you.
Sorry, I should have had it there.
No, that's right. There's a couple folks who are asking questions around the idea that, you know, the disease is so hard and takes so much from the person who's living with it, that at times it's really hard for family members to tap back into positive memories or earlier memories of that person. So there's two different aspects on this question. One is there an average period of time after the person has passed away that it takes before the loved ones, the survivors, are able to tap back into those positive memories?
No, there's not an average time. And even if there was, I would I would question it. Every person's process is so different. But if you are concerned about having a hard time remembering the good times, I would reach out to someone to talk and get professional help. It is a normal process of that acute grief, but that over time we know that changes and that you are able to access those really wonderful and positive memories. But I wouldn't give a timeline on it. I'm sorry. I know better.
Are there well, so but what you're saying is if after a period of time you really can't put yourself back, and maybe in even reviewing pictures and whatnot, that it's just really hard to hold on to those positive memories, that could be a sign that some additional help would be helpful, just to keep that process moving along. The other aspect is when in a family constellation where children are in the picture and they've experienced the losses of the disease in a parent and maybe don't have as many of those positive memories even to build on. Are there suggestions that you have for how to build or tap or bring that person back to life for a family where kids are involved and have been seeing this process over time?
That's such a devastating part of this illness. I think as you were asking this question, I was thinking about families being sure to tell stories about the person and have other family members and friends tell the really meaningful stories about that person to the children, so that they know there was another time and that there was another place where this person was very different. And so I think, yeah, having other family and friends in the community be the ones to also supplement those memories and those experiences.
And certainly where there's opportunities, I know many families with younger kids will take advantage of technology to record, to have voices, to have stories being read to the kids, so that there is a digital memory that can be brought back as
That's
part
great,
of that
beautiful,
experience as well.
In our support group last month, members were talking about a website called Tribute, where you can send an invitation out to family to record a certain video. And so there's wonderful ways of technology offering the chance to tell those stories and create those memories.
So thank you for that. And as a support group leader, this question I think will resonate with you. Somebody says that it was actually suggested that they join a support group, and they did, but that after joining, they actually felt more depressed, and that provided some additional challenges they weren't expecting. Can you speak to that experience in light of our conversation today?
Yeah, I think that's so normal. It's also something I I tell people in the beginning of my work that because we're starting to unpack some of this, you might feel it might feel really hard before it starts to feel easy again because you haven't yet explored some of these things. And a support group in that same way, you're hearing other people's experiences, you're hearing other possible symptoms, you're hearing other paths of the disease that you hadn't yet imagined. I think recognizing that every story is different, that their story might not be your story, and that the purpose of the group is for you to receive support from other people and give support to other people. The purpose is not for you to feel more worried and anxious afterwards. And so if you are feeling those things, I'd want you to I guess explore that a little bit more. Are you dealing with more anxiety and depression than you've really recognized, and maybe finding some more tools to cope with those symptoms as well?
Great, thank you. Someone's asking about having a spouse in long-term care who calls several times a day begging to come home, and happens. And I'm sure that you've encountered this as well. This has been happening over a period of time. He has no insight into his illness, and the guilt that you spoke about earlier in the presentation is overwhelming. Questions you have for trying to cope with this?
Yeah. A few thoughts. Redefining your role and your relationship might be really helpful in this example. So you have been picking up the phone, but it's okay to also not pick up the phone. Redefining some boundaries that you need around this, so that you can cope, and that you can really question that guilt. You didn't do anything wrong. Guilt can be so tricky in that way to make us feel like we did something wrong, but you've done nothing wrong. You're doing the best you can, and this is the disease causing this this symptom. So yeah, I think recognizing that you have done nothing wrong. In fact, you have done an incredible job of keeping him safe. And so when that guilt does pop up, to really question that, and question your expectations of yourself. Do you expect yourself to answer the phone every time? It's okay if you don't. So to kind of reevaluate what you're being hard on about yourself, and what you're being critical of, and what you're expecting of yourself.
Thank you. Can you speak a little bit about COVID-19? We know this is such a complicating factor for folks, whether they're caring for a loved one at home or in a facility. Is that a multiplier effect? Is there an impact of COVID-19 on the grief process? And what's your experience with that been?
Yes. There is this collective grief we're all doing because of COVID-19 woven into your own loss and grief experience right now. The feelings associated with knowing the person is safe, perhaps at a facility, or being a little bit worried about what is happening there, but not being able to see them, or even if it's a window visit or a porch visit, seeing other people touch them, other staff at the facility get so close to them when you can't, and just that longing for that connection. As the disease progresses, in normal times, if someone is in a facility, we have had that ability to go see them and to go be with them and to have that physical touch and that contact, that closeness, that intimacy is taken from us, is robbed of us in this pandemic. Being home without the normal resources and supports that we normally have when not in a pandemic is especially challenging right now, and probably exacerbates a lot of the feelings I've described of the anger, the guilt, the just being more irritable because we're together all the time. But I think that speaks to all the more reason that we need either our virtual support groups or people who are local to you that you can connect with, either online or socially distanced, to still stay safe.
Yes, thank you. You know, when we were putting together our booklet on grief, Walking with Grief, Bridget Moran McCabe in our office did a tremendous amount of work with that, and brought up from her experience some differences for people who lose a loved one who's living at home and who lose a loved one who's in a facility. And I wonder if that's something that you've encountered, and if you could speak to that a little bit, sort of how families' experience of grief at the end of life might be by the loss, depending on how it unfolds.
I think it goes back to that initial concept of the loss shaping the grief. So how a person dies also affects how we grieve. If it felt like a very traumatic or a very sudden death, that is going to affect how we grieve, versus a person being on hospice, having palliative care, knowing that this was coming, planning, and having that support of hospice around at the time. So while it is so unique, how a person dies does affect our grief. If we feel it was peaceful, if we feel it was the way they wanted it to be, or if we feel like something went wrong, and that's why the person died sooner than they had planned or anticipated or expected. Yeah.
Are there resources for people to process the grief after the loved one is gone? Are there resources you recommend in terms of grief support or bereavement support?
There certainly are. I want to emphasize that because grief is this very natural and normal process, most people don't need to access support. They are able to move through this on their own, but that doesn't mean that support isn't helpful in that process. So I guess I just want to say that to make sure that people don't feel like there's something wrong with them if they feel like they need support. There's nothing wrong with what you're feeling. It is very normal and natural, and again, it is part of your healing. But, you know, depending on where you are, there might be, where you live geographically, there might be different grief resources. A website that I included, grief.com, has a great directory for counseling and for groups. I think the FTD support group network is an important place to process our loss, and we definitely do that in our groups. But processing loss after a person has died can take place through, if a person was on hospice or had palliative care, those centers usually offer a source of a kind of support group that's available to families. So there are different types of groups and different settings available, obviously all online right now. But I would contact either, if you're close with your primary care provider, or the facilitators of the FTD groups might know more about what is local to you.
And so to some extent, I think it's often a combination of supports as well, right? So there are grief supports that may not be FTD specific that can be very, very helpful. Mm-hmm. As you mentioned, if people have a connection with an FTD group or other caregivers they've met online or other folks who've gone through that part of the disease, that combination might offer, you know, just options for people. And the more options, the better. We do know that some folks really, really find it helpful to connect with FTD caregivers around their grief process because there are unique aspects of it before and after the death. And others don't. Other people find what they need, as you say, in very natural ways and in many different ways. So honoring your own sort of instincts for what would be helpful, I think, is really important in that as well. Our crack team here looked up the app that you were describing, Mary. And so for folks who are still with us wondering about that, it's called Grief Steps for Parents.
Great, thank you.
That you might want to Google Grief Steps for Parents. And thanks, Lauren, for doing that research for us in the background. And I think that that's all we have time for today. We've been having a wonderful conversation, and really I thank you, Mary, for bringing all of your experience and your background and your just your care and concern for families to share with us today around this topic. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you for everyone for being here.
And so with that, we'll be wrapping up our webinar for today. And I want to thank everybody for joining us and Mary for presenting with us today. We hope that you found this to be an informative and certainly a reassuring presentation. We have recorded this. We'll post the recording to AFTD's website under News and Events, and we'll send out the link and make it available as soon as we can. And I wanted to let you know about another upcoming event. On December 3rd, we'll have a special event presented jointly by AFTD and the FTD Disorders Registry. Representatives from Prevail Therapeutics will be joined by Dr. Eric Roberson from the University of Alabama at Birmingham to discuss advances in the field of gene therapy. And Diana Wheaton, the director of the FTD Disorders Registry, will host this particular webinar on December 3rd. So watch for the opportunity to register for that coming up soon. So thank you for joining us today. Please let us know if you have any comments or questions about today's presentation or other ways that AFTD can assist you in moving forward in your own journeys. Please be sure to visit our website and make use of the AFTD helpline if you need to. And until next time, we wish you very, very well, and stay safe and healthy and resilient. Thank you all very much. And Mary, thank you.
Thank you.